In the sterile silence of the city's most exclusive hospital suite, Arthur Vance was a king reigning over a crumbling kingdom of one. The view from his panoramic window showcased a sprawling metropolis he had helped build, a cold testament of steel and glass that reflected the emptiness in his own chest. Machines, worth more than most people's homes, beeped in a steady, monotonous rhythm, counting down the seconds of a life that had always been measured in dollars and acquisitions. A rare disease, impervious to wealth and influence, was methodically dismantling him from the inside out. The air, thick with the scent of antiseptic and defeat, was a cruel reminder that for all his power, he couldn't command his own cells to live. He was a titan trapped in a fragile shell, watching the empire he conquered from a gilded cage. Two of the world's most renowned specialists stood near the foot of his bed, their hushed tones failing to conceal the gravity of their verdict. They spoke in a language of failed trials and exhausted protocols, their words painting a grim picture of medical science reaching its absolute limit. Every experimental drug had been a dead end, every specialist a new harbinger of the same bad news. They spoke of his last, desperate chance, a bone marrow transplant. But it wasn't a simple matter. Arthur's condition was linked to an incredibly rare genetic marker, a biological needle in the haystack of humanity. The odds of finding a perfect match, they explained with clinical compassion, were less than 1 in a million. For the first time in his life, Arthur faced a problem his checkbook couldn't solve, and the silence that followed their words was heavier than any boardroom negotiation. While the titans of medicine conferred, a figure moved almost unseen in the periphery. Maria, a janitor and single mother, pushed her mop across the polished floor, her movements quiet and deliberate. She had perfected the art of being invisible, a ghost who cleaned up the remnants of life and death without ever becoming part of the story. She wore her exhaustion like a second uniform, a quiet resilience etched into the lines around her eyes. Her life was a world away from the luxury of this room. It was a daily struggle of bus rides, overdue bills, and packing a lunch for her son with hands that were perpetually tired. She tried to block out the hushed conversations, to focus on the rhythmic swish of her mop, but some words have a way of piercing through any defense. Then she heard it. One of the doctors, reviewing a chart, spoke the name of the genetic marker aloud. It was a long, clinical term, a string of letters and numbers that meant nothing to them beyond a medical anomaly. But to Maria, that name was a thunderclap. Her hand froze, the mop handle suddenly slick in her grip. It was a name she knew not from a textbook, but from the stories her grandmother used to tell, a unique trait, a specific bloodline signature that ran through the women in her family like a secret river. It was the reason her cousin had been a perfect match for her aunt years ago. It was a piece of her identity, a biological heirloom she never imagined would have any significance beyond the boundaries of her own small family. Her gaze lifted from the floor and fell upon the man in the bed. She had seen his picture in the news, but now she truly saw him. Arthur Vance, the CEO of Vance Industries. The name of the company was seared into her memory, a permanent scar on her heart. It was the same company where her husband had worked, the same factory where a preventable accident had stolen him from her and their son. The doctors finally left the room, their footsteps echoing a death sentence. Maria stood motionless, a storm of grief and disbelief raging within her. The man responsible for her deepest pain was dying, and she, the invisible woman cleaning his floors, held the one and only key to his survival. He didn't know it yet, but his fate was now in the hands of a ghost from his past. The mop clattered against the stainless steel bucket, the sound echoing the sudden chaos in Maria's mind. For a long moment, she was paralyzed, a statue of disbelief in the opulent silence of the hospital suite. The name of the genetic marker, a casual string of syllables from a doctor's mouth, had detonated a bomb in the center of her world. Her first, overwhelming instinct was to flee. She wanted to erase the last 5 minutes, to unhear the words that now bound her to the man in the bed. With trembling hands and frantic jerky motions, she finished her work, smearing water across the pristine floor. She had to get out, to escape the crushing weight of this impossible knowledge. The sterile air felt suffocating, thick with the ghosts of her past and the unbearable burden of a future she never asked for. Back in the dim, cramped janitor's closet, the pungent smell of ammonia and damp rags did nothing to clear her head. The clinical term for the genetic marker kept replaying in her thoughts, a cruel refrain intertwined with the vivid, painful memories of her husband, Daniel. She could almost feel the rough texture of his work jacket, smell the faint scent of machine oil and sawdust that always clung to him. Then came the other memories, the ones she fought to keep buried, the shrill, unending ring of the telephone, the detached voice delivering the news, and the sterile, corporate-stamped letter from Vance Industries. It spoke of a tragic, unforeseen accident, denying all liability while offering a sum of money that felt more like an insult than an apology. The raw, searing injustice of it all, a wound she thought had scarred over, was torn open once more. The long bus ride home was a blur of rain-streaked windows and indistinct city lights. Each distant flicker seemed to mock the darkness that had enveloped her heart. Staring at her own reflection in the glass, she saw not just a tired janitor, but the keeper of an impossible secret. What would she tell her son, Leo, when he was old enough to truly understand how his father had died? What lesson would she be teaching him if she chose vengeance, however passive? Her grandmother's voice, a warm and distant echo from her childhood, whispered in her conscience, "To hold a grudge is to let someone live in your heart rent-free, Mija. Forgiveness is how you evict them." The thought was agonizing. Showing mercy to Arthur Vance felt like a profound betrayal of Daniel's memory, a dismissal of her own enduring pain. But the alternative felt like a poison, a silent act of cruelty that would slowly corrode her own soul. That night, sleep offered no escape. Maria sat by Leo's bedside, watching the gentle, rhythmic rise and fall of his small chest. He was the center of her universe, the reason for every sacrifice, every exhausting shift. He was also a living, breathing reminder of the life Arthur Vance's negligence had stolen from them. Saving this man wouldn't bring back a husband or a father. It wouldn't erase the years of struggle or mend the fracture in their lives. A part of her, a dark and wounded part, whispered that letting him face his fate was the only justice she would ever get. But then she pictured Arthur Vance not as the faceless CEO in a newspaper clipping, but as the frail, diminished man in that hospital bed, his power rendered useless by his own fragile biology. In that shared vulnerability, a tiny, defiant spark of empathy began to glow. As the first grey rays of dawn crept through her apartment window, Maria felt a sense of clarity settle over her. The turmoil of the night had subsided, leaving behind not peace, but a resolute, terrifying decision. It was a choice that defied logic and reason, a choice born not of forgiveness, she wasn't there yet, but of a refusal to become the very thing she hated, a person who would stand by and do nothing while another human being suffered. Her hands were shaking as she found the number for the hospital's transplant coordinator on a crumpled flyer she'd stuffed in her pocket. Taking a deep, shuddering breath that felt like it was being pulled from the very depths of her soul, she made the call. She knew, with chilling certainty, that her life, and the life of the man who had destroyed it, was about to change forever. The first official meeting between them was an exercise in suffocating silence, a stark contrast to the urgent flurry of medical activity that had preceded it. Arthur Vance, propped up by a mountain of sterile pillows, watched Maria as if she were a complex legal document he couldn't decipher. He was accustomed to people who wanted something from him, their motives as transparent as the glass walls of his office. Yet this woman, who held his life in her hands, met his calculating gaze with a quiet, unreadable calm. She sat in the visitor's chair, her hands folded in her lap, her posture conveying a stillness that seemed to absorb the anxious energy of the room. He saw the faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the worn fabric of her coat, and felt a disorienting mix of desperation and suspicion. This was not a negotiation he understood. The rules were different, and for the first time, he had no leverage. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the hushed room. "I assume you have a number in mind?" Arthur began, his voice raspy but retaining its old boardroom authority. "Name it. A house. Your son's education. A fund for the rest of your life. Whatever it is, consider it done. My lawyers can have the paperwork drawn up within the hour." He watched for a reaction, a flicker of greed, a hint of relief, but found none. Maria simply shook her head, a slow, deliberate motion that seemed to dismiss his entire world of currency and contracts. "This isn't about money, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice soft but firm, carrying a weight that his millions could not move. The simple refusal hung in the air between them, a statement so foreign to Arthur's reality that it left him utterly speechless, adrift in a sea of confusion. A few days later, during the preliminary medical screenings, Maria arrived not with a lawyer, but with a small, insulated bag. She placed a container of soup on his bedside table, the warm, savory scent of chicken and vegetables cutting through the antiseptic air. "A hospital food is no good for healing," she stated simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Arthur stared at the container, then back at her, baffled by the gesture. It was a simple, maternal act of kindness, something he hadn't experienced since his own mother passed away decades ago. He watched as she spoke quietly about her son, Leo, and his love for her soup, her face softening with a warmth that made the cold, luxurious room feel momentarily like a home. For a brief instant, he wasn't a CEO and she wasn't a janitor. They were just two people sharing a quiet moment of unexpected humanity. That small act of compassion cracked the armor he had worn for a lifetime. Later that afternoon, as a nurse drew another vial of his blood, Arthur found himself asking a question that wasn't a command or a negotiation. "You mentioned your son," he said, his voice softer than before. "Is it just the two of you?" Maria's warm expression flickered, a shadow of deep, old pain passing through her eyes before she composed herself. "Yes," she replied, her gaze drifting toward the city skyline. "His father. He was a good man. He loved building things with his hands. He always said that every person deserves to come home from work safely." The words were a quiet tribute, but for Arthur, they felt strangely pointed. A puzzle piece whose sharp edges he couldn't quite place. He sensed a profound story of loss behind her calm demeanor, a secret she held close to her heart. The call from the head specialist finally came, delivered with an air of breathless triumph. The compatibility was perfect, a biological miracle against impossible odds. The transplant could proceed as soon as they were both ready. A wave of relief, so powerful it almost hurt, washed over Arthur. He was going to live. He turned to Maria, who had been standing by the window, a silent witness to his reprieve. Gratitude, raw and overwhelming, filled his chest. "I don't understand why you're doing this," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "But I owe you everything. Please, just tell me what you want. What is your condition?" Maria turned from the window, her eyes meeting his. The sorrow he had glimpsed earlier was now fully present, mixed with an unshakable resolve. "My condition," she said slowly, "is that you must first listen to a story. The story of a man named Daniel." The name Daniel settled in the sterile air, instantly changing the room's atmosphere from one of fragile hope to one of heavy, impending judgment. Arthur Vance, a man accustomed to controlling every narrative, found himself a captive audience. Maria began to speak, her voice low and steady, not with the fire of accusation he might have expected, but with the quiet reverence of a cherished memory. She painted a portrait of her husband, not as a victim, but as a vibrant, living man. She spoke of his hands, calloused from work but gentle in their touch, of the way his laughter filled their small apartment, and of his simple, profound dream to build a life where their son, Leo, would want for nothing. Arthur listened, his initial impatience giving way to a strange, unfamiliar pang of something akin to envy for a life so rich in meaning, a world away from his own hollow accumulation of wealth. Her narrative then took a somber turn, the warmth in her voice receding like a fading light. She began to recount the final morning, a day that began with the mundane ritual of a shared breakfast and a quick, familiar kiss goodbye at the door. She described the worn lunchbox Daniel carried and his promise to be home in time to fix Leo's broken toy truck. Each detail was a brushstroke in a masterpiece of impending tragedy, drawing Arthur deeper into the story. She spoke of the creeping unease that settled over her as the hours ticked by, the unanswered calls to his phone, and the way the afternoon sun, casting long shadows across the floor, seemed to mock her growing dread. The sterile quiet of the hospital room dissolved, replaced by the suffocating silence of a home where a wife waited for a husband who would never return. The moment of impact in her story arrived not with a shout, but with a quiet, official knock on her door. Maria described the two men in dark, ill-fitting suits from Vance Industries, their eyes avoiding hers as they recited a rehearsed speech. They used sterile, impersonal words like unfortunate operational failure and unavoidable mechanical malfunction to describe the end of her world. Then came the envelope, a crisp, white messenger of death containing a check and a legal document designed to silence her grief. As she uttered the name of his company, it landed between them with the force of a physical strike. The blood drained from Arthur's face as he finally understood. Daniel wasn't just a random name. He was a ghost from a forgotten ledger, an entry in a column of acceptable losses, a man whose death had been a footnote in a quarterly earnings report he had once signed off on without a second thought. The revelation hit Arthur with the force of a physical collapse, more debilitating than any symptom of his disease. He remembered the incident now, but only as a distant abstraction, a risk assessment, a legal settlement, a minor financial liability that was efficiently managed and quickly forgotten. He had never seen a face, never heard a name, never once considered the shattered lives left in the wake of his company's negligence. In his relentless pursuit of profit, a human life had been reduced to a mere number. Now that number had a name, Daniel, and a face, the grieving woman sitting before him, the very woman who now held his own life in her hands. He saw the years of her struggle reflected in her tired eyes, the quiet dignity of a single mother who had endured a pain he had never bothered to acknowledge. Maria finished her story, and a profound silence filled the room, thick with the weight of a long unsettled debt. She had not demanded vengeance or screamed for justice. She had simply unwrapped her wound and asked him to look. Her quiet strength was a mirror reflecting his own moral bankruptcy, stripping away the layers of power and success to reveal the empty man beneath. He was a king whose castle was built on a foundation of forgotten sorrows. The irony was devastatingly cruel. His chance at a future was being offered by the one person to whom he had denied one. Arthur Vance was on the verge of being saved, of receiving a biological pardon for his body's failings. But what he didn't know is that his soul's judgment was just beginning, and fate was about to collect its due. The silence that followed Maria's story was a heavy shroud suffocating the sterile hum of the machines. Arthur Vance, a man who had commanded boardrooms with an iron will, felt utterly dismantled. The truth of his complicity was a poison more potent than the disease in his veins, and it left him hollowed out. He looked at Maria, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a janitor, not as a donor, but as the judge in a trial he hadn't known he was facing. With a voice stripped of its former power, now just a ragged whisper, he finally spoke. I understand, he managed, the words tasting like ash. Listening to your story, acknowledging what my company did, that was your condition. I accept it. I am so sorry. He believed this was it, the painful penance required to receive her life-saving gift. He was ready to live with the guilt, a small price to pay for survival. Maria, however, did not offer a comforting nod or a sign of absolution. Instead, she slowly shook her head, a gesture that sent a fresh wave of ice through Arthur's veins. The quiet resolve in her eyes was unnerving, a depth of purpose he was only just beginning to comprehend. "No, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice gentle but firm, cutting through his fragile hope. "You misunderstand. Listening to Daniel's story was not my condition. It was merely the prerequisite." The room seemed to shrink around him, the panoramic view of his city turning into a mocking backdrop for his own ignorance. The relief that had tentatively begun to bloom in his chest withered instantly, replaced by a profound and terrifying uncertainty. He had thought he'd reached the end of this moral negotiation, only to find he was standing at the very beginning. From her worn canvas bag, she pulled not a container of soup, but a thick, neatly bound folder. The cover was simple, unadorned, yet it seemed to hold more weight than all the legal contracts he had ever signed. She placed it on the sterile white sheets of his bed with a quiet reverence. The soft thud echoed the sound of a gavel in a courtroom. Before he died, Maria explained, her gaze fixed on the folder, Daniel spent his nights and weekends working on a plan. He was creating a non-profit foundation to provide immediate financial and legal support for the families of workers lost in industrial accidents. He had notebooks, budgets, a mission statement, everything. He called it the Daniel Project. Arthur stared at the folder, a blueprint for a better world conceived by a man whose own world he had allowed to be destroyed. Then came the turn, the moment that shattered his reality. Maria met his gaze, her eyes holding no malice, only an unshakable conviction. My condition, Mr. Vance, is not that you write a check to fund this project. My condition is that you become its director. You will use the life I am giving you to build it from the ground up. You will use your business acumen, your connections, your ruthless efficiency, not to build another skyscraper, but to build this foundation. You will meet every family. You will learn every name. You will spend the rest of your days giving back the lives your company so carelessly took. It wasn't a request for charity, it was a demand for his very soul, a complete and total repurposing of his existence. He was being offered a cure for his body in exchange for the forfeiture of his life as he knew it. The world tilted on its axis. In that instant, Arthur Vance ceased to be the powerful CEO. His wealth, his empire, his legacy, all of it evaporated, rendered meaningless by the quiet, earth-shattering proposition from the woman in the janitor's uniform. She wasn't just a donor, she was the architect of his new destiny. The bone marrow transplant would save him from death, but her condition was a sentence to a new kind of life. One of service and penance, a life dedicated to honoring the man whose memory he had desecrated. The choice was impossibly clear. He could refuse and die in his gilded cage, or he could accept and live as a servant to the ghost of his greatest sin. He felt the floor fall away, his entire world turned completely upside down by the shocking weight of her grace. A surge of cold, reptilian pride coiled in Arthur's gut, instantly eclipsing the fragile gratitude he had felt moments before. The proposal was not an offer of redemption. It was a hostile takeover of his very soul. He saw it as a meticulously crafted humiliation, a way to strip him of his power and chain him to the ghost of a man he didn't even remember. His entire life had been defined by control, by bending the world to his will, and now this woman, a janitor, was dictating the terms of his existence. The idea of becoming a public servant to his own past sin, of spending his remaining years atoning under the banner of the Daniel Project, was a punishment more profound than death itself. The sterile room, once a symbol of hope, transformed into a courtroom where he had just been handed a life sentence of servitude, and his wounded ego roared in silent protest. His shock curdled into a familiar, biting condescension. "This is a form of blackmail," he hissed, his voice regaining some of its old, sharp authority. He pushed the folder for the Daniel Project off his lap, letting it slide onto the floor with a soft, dismissive thud. "You come in here with your tragic story and a perfect biological match, and you think that gives you the right to orchestrate my future. I offered you wealth, a life of ease for you and your son. That is compensation. That is justice in the real world. This," he gestured vaguely at the fallen folder, "is a fantasy, a self-righteous crusade built on my desperation." He needed to reframe her act, to twist her grace into something transactional and ugly, because that was a language he understood. He saw her not as a savior, but as a clever adversary who had found his ultimate weakness. Maria did not rise to the bait. She stood with a quiet, unshakable stillness, her composure a silent rebuke to his venomous words. Her lack of anger was more disarming than any argument, leaving his accusations to hang in the air and rot. Her eyes held no triumph, only a deep, sorrowful disappointment, as if she were watching a child refuse a life-saving medicine simply because it tasted bitter. This silent judgment was a mirror reflecting his own spiritual poverty, and it made him feel small and exposed. He had built an empire on his ability to intimidate, to find the cracks in his opponent's armor. But Maria had no armor. She had only her quiet conviction, and against it, his rage was as useless as his fortune. He felt the last vestiges of his control slipping away, leaving him adrift in a sea of his own making. The afternoon light began to fade, casting long, somber shadows across the room that seemed to mock the darkness gathering in his heart. Every beep of the monitor was a tick of a clock counting down to a fate he had just chosen. He was being offered a miracle, a second chance at life, but his pride was a poison for which there was no antidote. To accept her terms meant the complete annihilation of his identity. He would no longer be Arthur Vance, the master of the universe, but a living monument to his own failure, a man defined by his greatest sin. He saw his legacy, his name, his entire life's work turning to ash. He would rather face the physical abyss of death than the ego death her condition demanded. A single hot tear of pure, impotent fury escaped his eye, a testament to the war raging within him. With a final, sharp turn of his head, he presented her with his back, his gaze fixed on the cold, indifferent city. "Leave," he commanded, his voice a low, ragged whisper that carried the weight of a final verdict. "The deal is off. Tell the doctors you've changed your mind." He didn't want to see the look on her face, the pity or the quiet strength that so thoroughly dismantled him. He just wanted her gone. For a long moment, there was only the sound of his own labored breathing. Then, he heard her soft footsteps as she retrieved the folder from the floor, followed by the quiet, definitive click of the door closing behind her. He was alone, victorious in his defiance, yet utterly defeated, as the silence of the room settled around him like a shroud. A chilling question began to form. Had he just preserved his identity, or had he signed his own death warrant? The hours that followed Maria's departure were the longest of Arthur's life. The hollow victory of his pride quickly dissolved, leaving behind a silence that was no longer sterile, but funereal. Each rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was a hammer blow, counting down the seconds to an end he had foolishly chosen. He stared at his reflection in the darkened window, a ghostly silhouette against the glittering, indifferent city. He saw not the titan of industry he had always believed himself to be, but a withered, pathetic old man. Isolated by his own arrogance, he had spent a lifetime building walls to protect his power, and now he was going to die within them, completely and utterly alone. The crushing weight of his solitude was a physical pain, a final, brutal symptom of a life lived for nothing but himself. He had rejected his only chance at a future, not for a principle, but for the fragile shell of his own ego. As the night deepened, a profound shift occurred within him. The memory of Maria's face returned, not with the triumphant smirk of a blackmailer, but with the deep, sorrowful disappointment of a teacher watching her student fail a crucial test. He finally understood. Her condition wasn't a punishment. It was a map. It was a pathway out of the empty fortress he had built, an invitation to a life of purpose that his wealth could never purchase. She wasn't asking him to abandon his legacy. She was offering him a real one. The image of the folder lying discarded on the floor burned in his mind. It represented a life spent honoring a good man, not a life spent accumulating cold assets. He realized with devastating clarity that dying with his pride intact was the most meaningless death of all. What was the point of saving a body if the soul inside had already rotted away? A desperate, primal urge to live, truly live, surged through him, overriding the years of calcified pride. With a trembling hand, he fumbled for the call button, pressing it with a frantic energy he hadn't felt in months. A nurse rushed in, her face a mask of professional concern. "Find her," Arthur rasped, his voice cracking with an emotion he couldn't name. "The janitor, Maria, please, you have to find her before she leaves. Tell her I was a fool." The words tumbled out, a raw and unfiltered confession that stripped him bare. There was no negotiation, no strategy, only the desperate plea of a drowning man reaching for a lifeline. He was no longer a CEO giving an order, but a broken man begging for a second chance. His entire future hanging on the hope that his last, most selfish act had not been his final one. The nurse found Maria by the employee exit, her hand on the door, ready to step out into the rainy night and never look back. When she was led back to Arthur's suite, she found him not propped up like a king, but hunched over, his face buried in his hands. He looked up as she entered, and the tears streaming down his face were not of fury, but of profound surrender. "I was wrong," he whispered, the words carrying the weight of a lifetime of arrogance. "So terribly wrong. You weren't offering me a punishment. You were offering me a purpose. You were offering me a chance to be a man my own father would have been proud of. Please, if the offer still stands, let me build it. Let me honor Daniel. Let me earn the life you are willing to give me." He looked at her, his defenses gone, his soul laid bare, waiting for his final judgment. Maria walked slowly to his bedside, her expression one of quiet, overwhelming grace. She reached into her bag and placed the folder for the Daniel project on the bed between them. This time, he didn't push it away. He reached out and placed his hand on it, his touch as reverent as if it were a sacred text. A single tear fell from her eye, not of sorrow, but of relief, a quiet acknowledgement of the human soul she had just witnessed being reborn. The tension in the room finally broke, replaced by a calm, luminous hope that felt more healing than any medicine. The transplant was no longer just a medical procedure, it was a covenant. As the first light of dawn began to break over the city, it illuminated a room where a life was not just being saved, but redeemed, and where the true work of healing was finally about to begin. 2 years later, the sterile silence of the hospital suite was a distant echo, replaced by the warm, vibrant hum of a small office teeming with life. This was the headquarters of the Daniel Project, a space filled not with cold steel and glass, but with worn wooden desks, walls covered in children's drawings, and the comforting aroma of brewing coffee. Arthur Vance, thinner but with a light in his eyes that had long been extinguished, sat not at the head of a boardroom table, but across from a young widow, his hands clasped around a warm mug. He was no longer issuing commands. He was listening, his entire being focused on her story, his expression one of deep, unfeigned empathy. He had traded his panoramic view of a cold, impersonal skyline for a window that looked out onto a simple neighborhood park, and in doing so, had finally found a world worth seeing. The park was where he often spent his afternoons with Maria and her son, Leo. They had formed a family of a different sort, one built not on blood, but on a shared history of loss and an improbable act of grace. Arthur was teaching Leo how to fly a kite, his movements patient and gentle, his laughter genuine as the wind caught the colorful diamond and lifted it toward the clouds. He was no longer the ruthless CEO, but simply Arthur, the man who knew the best stories and could fix any broken toy. Maria watched from a nearby bench, a soft smile on her face. She saw no trace of the man whose negligence had cost her a husband, only the man whose life she had saved, and who, in turn, had brought a quiet, steady sense of peace and security back into hers and Leo's world. Life, the universe teaches, rarely follows a straight line. Its most beautiful paths are often detours born from our deepest pain. Arthur would often stand before the simple, framed photograph of Daniel that hung on the foundation's wall. He no longer felt the sharp sting of guilt, but a profound and humbling gratitude. He understood now that Maria's gift was never just about the marrow in his bones. It was about the marrow of his soul. For true healing begins not with a cure that saves a life, but with an act of compassion that gives a life meaning. He had been given a second chance not merely to breathe, but to become a testament to the man whose legacy he was now privileged to build, proving that sometimes the greatest monuments are not made of stone, but of service. His journey serves as a powerful testament to the idea that it is never too late to rewrite our own story, to choose purpose over profit and empathy over ego. The connections that bind us are often invisible, woven from threads of shared humanity that we only recognize in moments of profound vulnerability. If this story of redemption and unlikely forgiveness has touched your heart, consider sharing it with others. Spreading messages of hope and compassion is a way of building our own small foundations of kindness in a world that so desperately needs them. Because every single act of grace, no matter how quiet, has the power to heal not just one person, but to ripple outward, mending the unseen fractures in the lives of many. The afternoon sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in strokes of orange and gold. Arthur, Maria, and Leo stood together on a small hill in the park, watching the kite dance against the vibrant canvas of the sunset. The wind was gentle, a soft whisper that carried the sounds of distant laughter. Arthur placed a reassuring hand on Leo's shoulder, his gaze meeting Maria's over the boy's head. In her eyes, he saw not a debt, but a shared peace, a quiet understanding that they had navigated the storm and found a shore of calm. There were no more secrets, no more anger, only the luminous glow of a new beginning. In the warmth of that fading light, surrounded by his unconventional family, Arthur Vance was finally truly healed.